What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Sunday, September 15th, Week 2 edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. We have a nice 13-game, I think, NFL slate today. Should be pretty interesting. Week 2 always pretty fun to talk about because you obviously get a bigger increase in information after Week 1 than after any other individual week. But at the same time, it is still a one-week sample. So it's fun to talk through and try and figure out, what conclusions are real, what things that happened in week 1 are going to continue, which ones aren't. And if you can figure those things out, it does give you an edge in week 2 when the field does tend to have, recency bias after week 1. So it's a pretty fun week to play. Looking forward to walking through it, talking about it. As a reminder, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel. All that stuff helps out quite a bit. Also, links in the description below to get access to both my content and just some really good DFS content overall. Endgame Syndicate, Uticow, Brick75, Nerdy Tenor, and myself. Intermediate and higher level DFS training videos, Discord access to us, and a group of really smart subscribers, high-level DFS players in there, just talking DFS. Highly recommend checking that out if you haven't already. All of my content is available there as well. If you only want the content, if the price point at Endgame doesn't make sense for your DFS volume, you can get access to that using the NFL content link in the description below as well. 7-day free trial on that. So check those things out if you haven't already. I am going to change the format of this show a little bit. Last week, I went position by position, and I realized that I think with NFL, that ends up being kind of awkward. Like I ended up just talking about every game anyway, basically, as I got to each quarterback. So today I'm going to go game by game and look at my player exposures. So not necessarily just breaking down each game, but just sorting that way, looking at my player exposures that way. And then at the end, I'll recap by going through position by position to highlight who I'm getting the most of. I think the show will just flow a little bit better that way. Joe Quotum said, any luck last night? Made a little bit yesterday. I tied for third on the main college football slate, lost a little bit, gave a little bit back on the night slate, but profitable day, which is always nice going into Sunday. Sucks going into Sunday after a really bad Saturday. So that was good at least. So starting with the Raiders and the Ravens, Baltimore, huge favorites in Baltimore, should or is likely to be a very different game script than we got last week when the Ravens were playing the Chiefs. Last week, we saw a pass-heavy Ravens offense. Lamar wasn't the most efficient or accurate, but they did throw a lot. That kind of scripted Derrick Henry out of the game as well. This week, obviously nothing guaranteed, but it is likely that we see a run-heavy Baltimore team, which would mean more Derrick Henry. I'm still not getting the much of him, though, which is kind of surprising to me, given that I do expect Baltimore to run the ball. Most likely they'll be ahead. And, we saw last week that Justice Hill was very involved out of the backfield. That's not a huge negative for Henry, even though it was last week. Henry's kind of usually throughout his career been this guy that when his team's ahead, when they're around the goal line, he's getting the vast majority of the touches. When they're playing from behind, he kind of becomes non-existent and useless. There were some exceptions when he was in Tennessee, but generally that's how he's been used, and it looks like that's how the Ravens are going to use him as well. So very, very game script dependent, but in positive game scripts, he's still going to have a huge role on this offense. Obviously Lamar Jackson does cut in to the percentage of carries that Derrick Henry gets, but as far as running back carries go, I do still expect Henry to dominate carries. He got 41% of them last week. Justice Hill only had 3%. The rest went to Jackson. So assuming they are ahead in this game, I like Henry's workload here. But that being said, I'm still just not getting there. Like I said, there are just a lot of really good running backs on this slate. Henry is getting some ownership at about 11%. So definitely one of those plays that I think is fine, is good. Also, I just don't really happen to be getting to him personally, but there's not really huge negatives for me. I'm not trying to talk anyone off of him. I'm just not really there. I'm not getting the much of this game at all. To me, the most interesting part outside of Henry is the tight ends from both teams. I'm not getting a lot of them, but Mark Andrews at 5K, also Isaiah Likely at 4,800. We saw the Likely breakout game last week. Clearly, you're not expecting him to be the leading receiver on this team every week, but I do expect the Ravens to continue utilizing a lot of 12 personnel sets, having Andrews and Likely both on the field together. That makes them both project pretty well. Andrews, obviously was shut down week 1. The major talking point was, if he's completely washed or not. I don't think he is. I think you're just going to see volatility, game to game. But I did like that he was still running routes last week. It's not like they were just keeping him in the block and Isaiah Likely was taking over as the pass catching tight end. So I do think that there is some bounce back potential for Andrews here at only 5K and low ownership. On the other side, only 4,400 for Brock Bowers on a slate that is pretty weak at tight end. This is a position that is very, very volatile. It kind of sucks to pay up at, even though clearly that's how you get the most talented guys. So Bowers at this price tag, I do think somewhat interesting. The Raiders are likely to be playing from behind. He did earn a high target share in week 1, which was good to see for a rookie. Very low average depth of target, but at the same time, that does lead typically to elevated or higher completion percentages. So I think any of the tight ends in this game are interesting. But like I said, just not getting a ton of exposure overall to this game. It is kind of scary not getting to the Ravens because obviously Henry has multiple touchdown upside, but there is also the complete other angle where what if the Raiders do keep this game somewhat competitive and you just have unowned Lamar Jackson and Andrews and Likely and Zay Flowers, who are obviously really, really talented. And if this game's competitive, likely to have big games. But one way or the other, I'm not really getting to this one. The next one, I do think I'm getting a lot of Tampa Bay taking on Detroit in Detroit. So playing in a dome, which is always going to be appealing. Baker Mayfield coming off of a big week 1 against Washington. I like him here as well, playing in Detroit. They are sizable underdogs, so you are likely to see them throwing throughout the game. Mayfield is still affordable at 5,900. Doesn't give you a ton of rushing upside, but he does correlate with a couple of pass catchers that look really, really good to me on this slate in Godwin and Evans. So that's pulling him up a bit. And you can see over here, I'm pretty much 2x the field. 15% Mayfield for me, 7.5% for the field. I am pretty much even with the field on Chris Godwin at 18 to 20%. I have about 21%. 6K price tag just looks good, particularly on DraftKings where it is full point PPR. Godwin played 50% of his routes ran 50% of his routes out of the slot last week, which historically has been beneficial for him. Last year, for context, he ran like 38%, if I remember correctly, of his routes out of the slot. So we did see an uptick there that was expected with Jalen McMillan being added as an outside wide receiver. So we should see increased efficiency from Godwin this year as long as he maintains that role. Mike Evans, 7,500, getting 6% ownership. I'm around 2x the field there. Had a big game last week. Obviously, he's always going to be a favorite end zone target for Baker Mayfield, but also sets up well again in this matchup. He does generally do better against man coverage. Teams do tend to play less man coverage against Baker Mayfield than against other quarterbacks because Mayfield is very good at beating it as well. But Detroit was high in man coverage percentage last week. Again, I expect that number to come down, but should still see plenty of it. Evans sets up nicely in this spot as well. Getting to a bit of Kate Otten here, 3,600, not getting any ownership. This is pretty much, if I'm playing Baker Mayfield, if I'm stacking the Bucks, why not be using the tight end? I think that's kind of going to be a theme throughout the show as well. Sort of, if anybody's watched my MLB shows, kind of like catchers, just I play whichever ones work in the stack a pretty high percentage of the time. That's kind of how tight end is in NFL and kind of, I think, how they're showing up for me this week. So, Kate Otten, not a priority at tight end, but he's not really any worse than most tight ends that people are going to play. And he is relatively inexpensive at 3,600. I'm not getting to as much Rachaad White as the field. I wouldn't mind it. He does catch a lot of passes. We saw Bucky Irving cut into his rushing workload a bit last week, but White still very, very involved as a receiver, pass catcher. Also, still got plenty of carries. But if this game is high scoring, if it is a shootout, if Tampa Bay is playing from behind, White still will be involved as a pass catcher. So I think he's a pretty good play. You can play him as part of a stack with Mayfield, but I am personally prioritizing the wide receivers here. I'm not really getting to the Detroit side, which is extremely surprising to me. I don't have. Okay, so I have a bad projection on St. Brown. I don't know why that happened, but that's why I'm not getting there. So that is messing things up a little bit. I don't know what I did, but I obviously uploaded something wrong. Amon-Ra St. Brown is one of my favorite plays on the slate, so that's why it stood out to me that I don't have any and that I did something wrong. He was underwhelming last week. You had Jameson Williams have the really big game, and Amon-Ra St. Brown not really do anything. Laporta not really do anything. I like those guys to bounce back here. Trying to pull up the stat now because I don't remember it off the top of my head, but last week you saw a lot of too high looks from Tampa Bay. You did not see a lot from the Rams, who the Lions played last week. So you would expect outside receivers against the coverages that the Rams ran last week to have big games. That opens it up for Jameson Williams, getting open down the field. It takes away the middle of the field. Based on how the Bucs played last week, I expect them to do more of taking away the sidelines, taking away deep shots down the sideline, leaving the middle of the field open. Does open things up for St. Brown on the shorter routes that Jameson Williams isn't running. Opens things up for Laporta down the middle of the field. So I do like both of those guys. Unfortunately, like I said, I can't see how much of them I'm getting to. I don't know how that happened, but either way, I do like St. Brown a lot. I expect to have a lot of him. Laporta, I may have a lot of. I think that the pricing still ends up being a bit of an issue there, just because if you are paying up for tight end, you tend to have to sacrifice, obviously, at running back or wide receiver, and tight end is still a really volatile position. But I do like Laporta quite a bit in this spot. Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jahmyr Gibbs, Laporta all look good to me. David Montgomery is interesting in large field tournaments because I do expect this game to be popular. I think Montgomery is a really good play in lineups where you don't have pieces of this game, because typically the Lions very clearly distinguish their running back roles, where Gibbs is the primary pass catcher and Montgomery gets a larger share of the workload when they're playing from ahead. So if this ends up being like a low scoring game, or a game where the Bucs just aren't scoring points and the Lions are just kind of running clock and playing with a big lead, you're likely to get a lot of production from Montgomery and then not a lot of production from the other pieces of this game that everybody played. The Detroit passing game, Godwin, Evans, those guys. So in lineups that don't have a lot of this game, I do think Montgomery actually makes a lot of sense. Next, we have the Saints taking on Dallas in Dallas. The Saints are an offense in general that I do really like this year. I was optimistic about them coming into the season. We saw a lot of changes offensively in week one that should lead to better offense, better, more efficient routes from Olave and Shaheed than they were running last year, lower percentage of go routes, more pre-snap motion than last year, which they basically used none of it last year. So any is good to see. We didn't get a real game script in that one because the Saints just ran away with the game from the jump. So I think people are kind of maybe a little bit down on them still, thinking, it's a Derek Carr offense, Chris Olave, you can't trust him, blah, blah, blah. I do like them going forward. I don't necessarily like them much today. Very tough matchup here going up against the Cowboys. If you get to a little bit of Olave or Shaheed, I think it's fine. Obviously, they have high upside, but they are tough to prioritize in this matchup. CeeDee Lamb looks very, very good to me at 8,800. Getting 17% ownership, showed up in 31% of my lineups. Love getting to him here. I think he looks great. Luke Schoonmaker, not getting much ownership. I'm getting a little over the field on him at 2,900. The positive on him is simply that he is a pass-catching tight end at 2,900 on the Cowboys in a game where they're likely to score a lot of points. And obviously, Jake Ferguson is out. The downside here is that I do think you're going to see a rotation at tight end. I don't think you're going to see Schoonmaker just step in and get all of the opportunities. Last week after Ferguson's injury, we saw things split between Schoonmaker and a couple other guys, one being Hunter Lepke, who they specifically talked about. They like being able to use in a variety of roles, using him at tight end, using him at fullback. So I do think you're going to see those guys rotate through, but Schoonmaker probably gets the biggest workload here. And it kind of just comes back to, on a slate like this and most slates in general, my typical approach to tight end is mostly grab low-owned, cheap guys that have some touchdown upside and just hope to run good, because there's not a whole lot else that I think you can do at tight end. This is a slate where I think paying down for tight end is going to be the most frequent approach. There are a couple exceptions, Laporta, McBride, Kelsey, that we'll get to, but like Colby Parkinson's getting a lot of ownership. I expect Jordan Akins to get a lot of ownership at 3K. So kind of living in that price range is something that I'll probably be doing a lot of. And then just, getting to the lower owned guys like Cade Otton on Tampa Bay, like Schoonmaker here. So no real confidence in him, but he's low owned and he should get opportunities. I'm a little bit above the field on Dak. 6,700 kind of goes without saying. If you can get to him, there is upside. Pairing him with CeeDee Lamb is obviously going to look very, very good. So not a ton of overall exposure to this game. I'm a bit below the field on Alvin Kamara as well at 7K. We know the type of pass game involvement that he's likely to have. Obviously, he's a good PPR play. The problem for me, I think, is just that, one, Dallas is good defensively. There is some chance that the Saints just don't score a lot here, but that doesn't even necessarily matter all that much for Kamara. I think for me, it's mostly just the depth of the running back position. You have a ton of really good running back plays between like 5 and 6K, a couple that are a little bit north of 6K. And then you also have a couple of really good pay-up options, Breece Hall in particular, but you also have Jonathan Taylor, who's not that much more expensive than Kamara. So I think that's kind of just squeezing him out for me a little bit, even though he is perfectly fine. Giants taking on the Commanders in what should be a horrible football game, but does have some fantasy appeal because players in this game are cheap. And I'm getting a lot of players from this game. There's not one guy that I'm really jamming in like I was CeeDee Lamb at 31%. But Zach Ertz leading the way for me at 3,500. He's in 13% of my lineups. Field isn't getting to him much. There's nothing exciting about him. We saw a very, very short passing game from Washington in week 1. That was expected because, for one, we saw it from Kingsbury for 4 years in Arizona. We also saw it in the preseason when Jaden Daniels had what was basically just taking the snap and throwing it immediately. So that wasn't surprising. But Ertz, again, is just, if I'm going to play a decent amount of Daniels, and you see I have 11%, a lot of that is just going to be paired with Ertz because why not? Tight end's a weak position. Why not just positively get a little bit of positive correlation there, especially with somebody like Jaden Daniels, where you don't need to pair him with, a ton of pass catchers. He's going to get a lot of his fantasy production on the ground. Last week gave you 28 fantasy points without even throwing for a touchdown. That isn't going to happen every week, obviously, but he's somebody that, if you wanted to, you could play naked. I don't think you need tons of correlation between him and his receivers. And then also, it's not like there's a lot of receivers that you're foregoing by playing Zach Ertz. Terry McLaurin clearly has upside, but he's running a lot of short routes. He would have looked a lot better last week if Daniels had been able to connect with him on the wide open deep ball that he missed. But it's not like McLaurin in this role, in this offense, is like a slam dunk play or anything. Luke McCaffrey played a big role in week 1, which was really good to see. He's somebody that I expected to step up into a bigger role as the season goes on. He stepped into it pretty much immediately. He was the clear number 3, or I guess number 2 option, wide receiver option. As far as routes run, he was ahead of Zacchaeus. He was ahead of De'Ami Brown, but still was running extremely short routes. He actually had a negative average depth of target. So if you want to roster him, pair him with Daniels, fine. Obviously you're just kind of hoping that he houses a screen or something like that. I do still expect him to work into a bigger role as the year goes on as far as the routes that he's running. He's sub 4K. He's not going to be popular. I'm not getting to him, but he is somebody you could pair with Daniels. For me, though, the reason I prefer Ertz is just the lack of opportunity cost at the position. Like if you pair him with McLaurin, which is clearly fine, or McCaffrey, you're giving up a wide receiver spot on a slate that has a lot of really good wide receivers. And then you still have to find the tight end to play on a slate that doesn't really have good tight ends. So that's why Ertz is the one that's showing up for me the most with Daniels. Malik Neighbors, I like at 5,900. Disappointing week 1, but that was a game where Daniel Jones played absolutely horribly. That's not to say that I have any confidence Daniel Jones doesn't play horribly today, but Neighbors was heavily involved as far as running routes. He wasn't running super deep routes either, which is good. I'd be a little bit more concerned if he was, because I think there's a chance that Jones just continues to throw the ball underneath. He was running deeper routes than Wan'Dale Robinson, but it's not like he was just, averaging routes 20, 25 yards downfield or anything like that. So at 5,900, I do like a Malik Neighbors bounce back game here. I'm getting 11%, Fields at about 16. Already mentioned Jaden Daniels, obviously like him a lot. I have a couple lineups that have him without a pass catcher, and it's just paired with like Wan'Dale Robinson. But for the most part, like I said, pairing him with Ertz. Daniel Jones, 5,300 against a weak Washington defense. He's not good, but he's cheap. He's low owned. He has Malik Neighbors, which is nice. He has Wan'Dale Robinson, which is nice. Robinson only 4,300 coming off of a game where I believe he had 12 targets. I do think he's going to continue getting a lot of targets in this offense from Jones. They're not going to be deep down the field. You're going to have to hope that he does something with it after the catch. But I do expect the targets to be there, and he's cheap. So you have a couple of good stacking partners for Jones. You can also look to Theo Johnson as a $2,600 tight end. But yeah, it's basically he's cheap. He's facing Washington. He did run 6 times last week, only for 15 yards. But it was good to see him at least running a little bit because, as we know, when he does offer fantasy production, fantasy upside, you do need him to use his legs. Coming back from a lower body injury, it was good to see him at least running a bit in week 1. Washington defense looks fine against him. Really bad quarterback. There is sack upside going up against this offensive line, and getting to Jones, obviously, he's prone to make mistakes also. So getting to the Commanders is fine. Like I've said in the past, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about or looking at defenses. But generally, if I am going to like a defense, it's going to be because they can get pressure on the quarterback. Obviously, that leads to mistakes, and mistakes increase your chances of getting defensive touchdowns. But overall, defense is kind of just whatever lands in lineups for me that make sense. Indianapolis taking on Green Bay. I think this is a really interesting one with Jordan Love not playing for the Packers. There's not a lot of plays in this game that I like, but there are a couple that I think look good. Josh Jacobs, 6,500. He's only projected for 5% ownership right now. I don't like Josh Jacobs here, but I also think he's a really good tournament play, if that makes sense, and I'll elaborate on it. Josh Jacobs is likely to have a massive role here for the Packers. They have Malik Willis at quarterback. There is pretty much no chance in hell that the Packers are coming into this game wanting to throw the ball a lot. They should be leaning on the running game, and the running game is absolutely just going to go through Josh Jacobs. We saw it week 1. I expect it to continue. There's nobody really backing him up. Marshawn Lloyd is questionable. I haven't seen his status confirmed yet, but even if he's back, this is a rookie running back that missed the majority of the preseason with an injury. I don't expect him to really be cutting into Jacobs' workload all that much right out of the gate. If he's out, then obviously you just have an even more limited backfield. So I expect Josh Jacobs to get a ton of touches, a ton of opportunities here. His efficiency is why I said I don't like him. It should be very, very easy for the Colts to just stack the box here, make Malik Willis beat them with his arm, which he's not going to be able to do, and make life really difficult for Jacobs. The thing that makes him show up for me a lot in tournaments is the ownership projection. If this is somebody where the field was likely to be saying, oh, Josh Jacobs is going to get 25 touches, you have to play Josh Jacobs, I would like not getting to him if you were like 15% owned or something because of the efficiency issues. He could get 25 carries and get you like 8 fantasy points because he runs for 70 yards and catches a pass. But if the field is basically saying, oh, we're going to go to Jordan Mason because he's going to get all the carries, and we're going to go to Charbonnet because he's going to get all the carries, and we're going to go to all these other running backs and just completely ignore Josh Jacobs getting all the carries for the Packers, the upside is evident, even if the efficiency is likely to be an issue. So I do like him at low ownership. I'm getting to him a lot at that ownership projection. There is a chance that maybe he just ends up coming in a little bit higher owned because of how well he shows up for me. He's probably showing up that way for people that have a similar process to me also. But to me, he's like the perfect example of somebody that I just want to do the opposite of whatever the field is doing. I don't have a lot of confidence in his efficiency. I do have a lot of confidence in his opportunities. And if the field's just going to ignore him, then I will just hope that he finds ways to get into the end zone and be semi-productive, despite what is probably going to be a lot of stacked boxes against him. Packers defense, 2,600 going up against Anthony Richardson. I like this one at only 5% owned. 2,600 is really cheap. They're not popular. Anthony Richardson is certainly mistake prone. He's not a very accurate passer. He had the highest average depth of target by a mile last week also, which just increases your chances of being able to get interceptions as well. So the Packers at that price tag, I do think are pretty appealing. And then Jonathan Taylor as a low-owned pay-up option makes a lot of sense. I'm around 2x the field on him. He's only getting about 4% ownership. He is difficult to prioritize because of how deep and how strong the running back position is between 5 and 6K on this slate, and also because you have Breece Hall, who's a little bit less expensive than him. But there's no denying the upside that he offers. He is the clear running back, bell cow running back on this team. You don't have anybody really competing for touches from out of the backfield outside of Anthony Richardson. And Richardson does, obviously cut into Jonathan Taylor's touchdown equity, which is why Taylor doesn't project even better than he does, why he's not more popular than he is. But he's just another player that I think the gap between his median projection, which is kind of, just mediocre for his salary, and his ceiling is pretty big. And the field's probably not accounting for that volatility enough. So I do think he's a very good low-owned tournament play. So this is a game where I'll have a lot of overall exposure, I think, but not to that many players in particular. As an aside, we are also waiting on Josh Downs news. He is questionable. If he is back, that does just muddy the receiver room a bit. I assume he'd be somewhat limited if he returns, but it would probably cut into Adonai Mitchell's role. It might cut into Pittman a little bit. If he's out, it does make Mitchell look a bit better. It does make Pittman look a bit better. In tournaments also, obviously, Anthony Richardson is always going to be fine. I'm just not getting there. San Francisco taking on Minnesota. This is another game that I expect to have a ton of. Deebo Samuel, very, very likely to be my highest owned guy on this slate. I was talking to people in my Discord yesterday saying that I was scared how much Deebo I'm going to have. And in my first run today, he is showing up a ton. There's a lot of things to like about Deebo. There's a lot of different angles that you can talk about to justify playing him as well. For one, you just have him at a very favorable $6,800 price tag, playing with a somewhat rusty Brandon Ayuk, but also with no Christian McCaffrey. So there's more receiving volume to go around without McCaffrey. Jordan Mason's not a prominent pass catching back. Debo will handle a lot of those short routes, get screen passes, get design plays for him, all of that. He's also likely to get, 5 to 8 carries. So that adds to, his floor, his projection too, obviously. Also likely to get touches in the red zone. The Niners had 3 carries inside the 5 last week. Jordan Mason got 2 of them. Debo got 1. So, you have a hybrid, basically goal line running back / receiver here in Debo. And then he also matches up well with the types of defenses that Minnesota was running last week, both the types of zones that they were running. Debo just has historically done very, very well against them. So everything just sets up for him to have a good game. And then also from a game theory standpoint, in non-Jordan Mason lineups, Debo becomes even stronger because the easiest way for Jordan Mason to not have a good game at 5,200 and high ownership is, like, we know he's going to get the bulk of the carries, but if he just gets 20 carries, averages, 4 yards and change per carry, but doesn't get into the end zone, he's not going to end up being a good play because he doesn't give you a high reception projection. And one way that he doesn't get into the end zone is that Debo vultures his goal line carries. So I think you can play Debo and Mason together. I don't have any issue with that. I think that they are both underpriced. It's very easy to picture a game where they both do well in the same game. But in lineups that happen to not have Jordan Mason, playing Debo becomes even stronger. So that's another argument in favor of Debo. Jordan Mason likely to be the highest owned guy on the slate, projected for about 38% ownership. I'm around half of that at 18%. I think he's a good play at 5,200. He obviously projects well for the price. The issue that I have with his ownership is just the abundance of running backs today. There are a lot of running backs that are getting half or a quarter or even less of the ownership of Mason that have similar ranges of outcomes. He got 28 carries last week. There's no guarantee that carries over this week, even assuming that he is, the clear running back 1. Debo is going to cut into that. You could have Garendo cutting into it more this week than last week when he really did nothing. And again, because he's not likely to catch a lot of passes out of the backfield, you are touchdown dependent. And the thing to keep in mind is because you have so many good running back plays, you can't be viewing this as, if Jordan Mason gets me 14 or 15 fantasy points, he was a good play because he's only 5,200. He needs to be one of the highest scoring running backs because there are so many running backs around him that it's just likely a few of them have big games, whether that's Brian Robinson, Rashad White's 1,100 more. You have Montgomery, who's not that much more expensive. It doesn't even have to be a running back in his price range. You have both Chargers backs with Edwards and Dobbins in what's likely to be a run-heavy game script. There's really just no shortage of good running backs on this slate. So especially in larger field tournaments, just getting, a 3X or whatever from Mason isn't likely to actually win you anything, even if it just kind of makes you feel good. Maybe you get the fire emoji on DraftKings. It's not likely to actually win you anything. So I do think this is a spot sort of like the inverse of what I was saying with Jonathan Taylor, where the field is not likely to do a very good job of differentiating a very good median projection, point per dollar projection, from his actual range of outcomes. And the fact that the range of outcomes isn't all that different from a lot of guys around him. So he's still, I think, clearly a good play. I am playing him. 18% is a decent chunk of lineups. I just doubt that I'm going to get to him as much as the field because of how many other options there are to get to. Justin Jefferson, I like if you can find the salary, 8,300. Didn't do a ton in week 1. It was a game that Minnesota didn't have to continue throwing, but Sam Darnold did look really good. Hopefully that carries over this week. No Jordan Addison either, so there's a million targets to go around. No Addison, no Hawkinson. On the one hand, you could see that lead to less efficiency for Jefferson because it's even easier for defenses to key in on him. But on the other hand, he is Justin Jefferson. He is the best, or at least one of the best wide receivers in the NFL, and I don't mind taking my chances at 10% owned. Sam Darnold, only getting 4% ownership, 5,200, very cheap. Pair him with Justin Jefferson, you get a low-owned stack that involves the best wide receiver in the NFL in what is also pretty likely to be a high-scoring game. So I think that makes sense. Getting to a little bit of Jones, Johnny Munt pairs well with Darnold as well. He should be the primary pass-catching tight end. He was last week. There are more opportunities available too this week. One guy not showing up for me right now that I kind of thought would and that I sort of wish was is Jalen Nailor. He should step into a bigger role without Addison. He won the wide receiver role in the wide receiver 3 role rather in the preseason. Should step into a bigger role here. And in a limited sample, both in week 1 and last season, Naylor did show the ability to gain separation. He ranked really well in separation score in the fantasy points data suite. And so, again, there's no guarantee that carries over a larger sample. But the fact that we saw that from him in the opportunities that he has gotten, the fact that he won the wide receiver 3 role and was raved about in the preseason, and then now you have all of these kind of just abandoned targets with no Addison, does make me think Jalen Naylor is a pretty good play, even though for whatever reason at the moment I don't have much of him. That is something that I'm kind of hoping changes by lock, because I think you're going to see the field really looking to a few different value receivers, looking to the Rams with Tyler Johnson and Demarcus Robinson, looking, I think, to Allen Lazard on the Jets, looking to Yoshivis on the Bengals. I don't expect much ownership to come into Naylor, and so I do think he's a good tournament play, especially in lineups that have Sam Darnold. Chargers taking on the Panthers in what I think is one of the most interesting overreaction spots to week 1. Good game script, likely for the Chargers running backs, J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards. J.K. Dobbins coming off of a massive week 1. I'm getting the 6% of Dobbins, Fields at 12%. I think he's a perfectly fine play at 5,400. I clearly expect him to be involved here. I think he's getting a little bit more ownership than he deserves just because of how he performed in week 1, as opposed to the opportunities that he got. He essentially split carries with Gus Edwards. He had 10 carries. He had 3 targets. He just happened to go nuts on the 10 carries he got in a way that you clearly can't expect him to sustain. And then this is a game that the Chargers are likely to be playing from ahead because Carolina's offense is so bad and it's going to be so difficult for the Panthers typically to score points. If they're playing up multiple touchdowns, I think it's likely that you see Gus Edwards take on a bigger rushing role than Dobbins. If this game's competitive or the Chargers are somehow playing from behind, I think you see more Dobbins because he is the better pass catching back. But I think the field's just kind of overreacting to last week. At 5,400, again, perfectly fine. I just don't think he should be 12% owned. I think there's other options in this price range that are lower owned and have a very similar range of outcomes. Similarly, I'm not getting to him, but if you really wanted to go the extra mile in like a Millie Maker type tournament, for example, and play Gus Edwards at no ownership, it's not really that difficult to picture the game where Gus Edwards ends up getting, 18 carries, 2 touchdowns because he happens to fall into the end zone twice. The problem, and the reason I'm not really getting to him, is it is a loaded running back slate. He's not going to catch passes most likely, and that is so important on DraftKings. So, I do think Dobbins is the better of the 2 running back plays, but I think the ownership is just a little bit higher than it should be as an overreaction to week 1. For whatever reason, it just seems like a spot that a lot of people are just kind of ignoring the inputs and only looking at the outputs, probably, or maybe just because it's cool. Like, hopefully J.K. Dobbins has a big year. It would be really cool if he bounces back after getting hurt week 1 last year. Obviously a really talented running back with a really unfortunate injury history, but that doesn't change the fact that he got 10 carries last week. So, most importantly, split them with Edwards. So again, there is upside here. He's fine, but I think just going a little bit over-owned. The passing game for the Chargers is one that I keep looking at and wishing I could get to more than I am. This is likely to be a run-heavy game for the Chargers. You're not likely to get a lot of pass volume because they are likely to be up on Carolina, but they are a really cheap passing game with Justin Herbert at quarterback. Ladd McConkey stepped up and took on a big target share role last week. He's only 4,900, getting 6% ownership. I'm even with the field there. The types of defensive coverages that the Panthers played last week also leave open deep balls down the sideline. They are vulnerable to that, which does open the door for Josh Palmer and Quentin Johnston. Again, these aren't guys that I think I can actually prioritize, but they are just a group of receivers that I keep looking at and saying, like, man, I'm going to feel really stupid when Quentin Johnston catches a 60-yard touchdown at no ownership, and I don't have him even though I recognize the spot. So they are guys that, if you're like hand building a lineup and you need a low-owned receiver with upside or something like that, I do think like Palmer and Johnston are fine. But at the end of the day, as you can see, even with that in mind, I'm having a hard time actually playing them in tournaments. Cleveland taking on Jacksonville in another game that I think is really interesting and that I would like to be getting to. I am getting to not as much of this game as I was hoping. Jerome Ford, the exception. He's showing up 29% of the time for me, 9% ownership. This is another running back spot where I think he's very comparable to the guys that people are playing. And for whatever reason, he's just not getting the ownership. Like, you really can't convince me that Jordan Mason is that much better of a play than Jerome Ford to be getting 3 to 4 times the ownership. Ford dominated touches out of this backfield last week. He was involved in the passing game. The Niners obviously have a higher implied total than Cleveland, which is kind of driving the love for Mason as well. But Ford's such a heavy part of this team right now. He was top 5 in expected fantasy points last week based on opportunities and just not getting much ownership here. So I do like getting to him a lot, and that is cutting in, to how much Dobbins and Mason, and I haven't looked, but I'm assuming Charbonnet I'm getting to, and I'm perfectly fine with that. Jordan Akins, 7% projected ownership, showing up 13% of the time for me. 3K tight end. David Njoku is out for Cleveland. Akins is likely to run the majority of the routes at tight end. What he does with those routes is anybody's guess. These plays fail all the time, but he's as likely or more likely than any other cheap tight end to do well today, just given the opportunities. The passing game here is interesting to me. And like I said, I'm not really getting to it right now, but I still wanted to touch on it because I do find it appealing, at least in my head. Deshaun Watson was obviously bad in week 1. He also suffered from drops. He had one of the highest drop percentages of any quarterback last week. He was first in yards lost by drops. So it wasn't quite as bad as it was being made out to be. It was bad, but he's also still cheap. Amari Cooper obviously gives you upside at 6,200. Jacksonville played an insane amount of man coverage last week, despite going up against a Tyreek Hill offense. They kind of have to come down as far as man percentage goes as the year goes on because of how much they played. But if they are likely to be a man-heavy defense, that does open things up for Amari Cooper, does make him look a little bit better, does also make Watson look a little bit better. Elijah Moore, 3,600, not getting any ownership. That one's interesting to me just because, again, you have the field kind of keying in on a handful of sub 4K wide receivers, which is fine. Elijah Moore actually led this team in routes run last week. This is a former, very highly thought of wide receiver prospect that hasn't amounted to anything, in part because he was drafted by the Jets probably. So I think there's just kind of an unknown component to Elijah Moore at this point that makes him kind of interesting given the price tag, the lack of ownership, and the role that he played last week. Again, I think this is just kind of a little bit more interesting Cleveland passing game in my head than is showing up for me right now in lineups. And then on the other side for Jacksonville, last week we saw targets for their main 4 guys very, very condensed. Nobody broke away from the pack. Christian Kirk, Brian Thomas, Gabe Davis, Evan Ingram. Nobody broke away from the pack and had a huge target share. They were all between like 14 and 19%. Nobody else even got a target on this team. No wide receiver, rather, other than Parker Washington, I think, got 1. So we did see the targets just go to the places that we expect. The Jags as a whole didn't throw a lot last week. I expect that you continue to see targets condensed to that group, but I do think on a week-to-week basis, you will see, different guys have, kind of spike in their target share. And one thing that stood out from Cleveland last week is that they ran the least amount of too high looks by a wide margin, relying on their pass rush to keep them from getting beat deep. Obviously, they could cause problems for Trevor Lawrence here because of their pass rush. But if Lawrence does get time, Brian Thomas and Gabe Davis as deep threats, I think, look very, very good here. Again, I'm not really getting to them. Hopefully, honestly, that changes by the time we get to lock. But I did just really want to highlight this passing game because whether I'm getting to it or not, I do think it's an interesting one and one that you should consider when you make your lineups. I think there are reasons to think that this sets up nicely for both offenses, at least from a ceiling standpoint. Jets taking on Tennessee in a game that I think is going to get a decent amount of ownership, both for me and for the field. Breece Hall showing up 32% of the time for me. $7,400 price tag. He just looks very, very good. Heavily involved in the passing game. You know that he's going to dominate goal line touches. He's going to dominate carries out of the backfield. He's probably the best overall running back in DFS right now, especially with McCaffrey's sideline. I think he's the closest thing that we have to it, to McCaffrey. Also, especially with Bijan Robinson not on the slate. So absolutely love Breece Hall. So does the field. Nothing surprising there. But even on a slate that has a lot of really good running back plays, I'm not having trouble getting to Breece Hall at 30+%. Allen Lazard, 3,300. Good point per dollar projection, getting some ownership. But I do think he's just a pretty good chalk play, even though there is just always going to be a lot of volatility in these cheap wide receivers, because he did run a ton of routes last week. It's not just that he happened to get into the end zone a couple of times and didn't get a lot of opportunities. He ran a lot of routes, but he also showed the ability to separate last week. And that could just be a fluke, a 1 week thing. But I do think it's just kind of important to highlight because when you think about the Jets right now, Mike Williams ran 4 routes last week. So my assumption is that he's not stepping back into any sort of meaningful role this week. Lazard is the only guy other than Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall that I expect Aaron Rodgers to have any amount of confidence in, Conklin to some extent. But as far as the wide receivers go, it's Garrett Wilson, Lazard, and then I think just kind of falls off the face of the earth for Aaron Rodgers. So I expect him to keep looking to Lazard. If Lazard, I mean, he's only 28. Like, it feels like he's been around forever. I kind of think that he gets like equated with Randall Cobb coming over to the Jets, where Rodgers is just bringing in all of his old friends. But Lazard's not old. He's 28. He showed the ability to separate last week. He ran a ton of routes. I expect Rodgers to look his way. He's 3,300. I think he's a solid play at this price. I'm a little bit over the field there. Garrett Wilson also over the field. Very, very good receiver at 7,100. Pretty good matchup here. 24 point give or take implied total for the Jets. I like getting the pass to the receivers here. If you want to mix in some Aaron Rodgers with that, it's fine, but I don't think you have to. As you can see, I'm not really getting to Rodgers much. After that, I'm not getting too much here. Tony Pollard at 5,900 is somewhat interesting. We saw a split backfield for the Titans last week, but it was slanted in Tony Pollard's favor. He got the bulk of the touches. Tyjae Spears ran more routes, but Pollard had an equal target share to Spears. If this ends up being a game where the Titans are playing from 10, 14, 20 points down, then I think Tyjae Spears just kind of becomes the back and could actually have a good game because he's a very good receiving back. But if this is a competitive game, even if the Titans are behind by 6 points or whatever, if this is a competitive game, I do think Tony Pollard's in a pretty good spot. But there are just so many running backs to get to that I'm not really getting there. But certainly another guy in that 5 to 6K range that has a very high ceiling, if nothing else. Kyle Presley said, would you ever play Mason and Debo in the same lineup? Yeah, I think it's perfectly fine given their salaries. It's not very difficult to envision a game where Jordan Mason gets 20 carries, scores a touchdown, gives you 18 points at 5,200, which is pretty good. And then Debo maybe gets a rushing touchdown, catches like 8 passes, maybe gets a receiving touchdown too. They're both just cheap enough where I think that they are fine together. But I did mention it when we talked about that game. In lineups that do not have Jordan Mason, Debo is an even stronger play because he's the most likely candidate to steal goal line touchdowns from Jordan Mason. So if you're building a lineup where you're already saying, okay, this lineup only has a chance if 40% of Jordan Mason doesn't have a big game, you may as well just take that extra step and say, what's the most likely way he doesn't have a good game, and go ahead and throw Debo in there somewhere. Seattle taking on the Patriots. No Kenneth Walker in this one, so we should get a lot of Zach Charbonnet. Not a great matchup. The Patriots, good defensive team last year, likely to be pretty good this year. Charbonnet's getting 16% ownership. I'm at 13%. Last night, the ownership seemed like it was going to come in a lot higher on Charbonnet, and I was excited about it because I thought that he was another good but not great play in the 5 to 6K range. Not likely to be heavily involved as a pass catcher. Kenneth Walker doesn't play a big pass catching role. Charbonnet didn't in the games that he started last year. So you're not to say he won't get any targets, but you're mostly relying on his rushing workload. So at 5,800, he should get a bunch of opportunities. He makes sense, I think, around 10 to 15%. But I'm not going too crazy with him. I don't think his range of outcomes is different than somebody, say, like Jerome Ford or some other lower owned guys. Patriots defense looks fine. I'm getting to them. They're 2,800. They're pretty good. Like I said, not a ton of thought goes into defenses for me other than are you low owned and are you cheap? Ramondre Stevenson at 6,200 getting 12, 13% ownership. I'm with the field there. He dominated workload out of the backfield last week. I do think it's likely we see Antonio Gibson take on a bigger pass catching role going forward. He had dealt with, I think it was turf toe, but I could be completely wrong on that. I do know he had dealt with an injury at the end of preseason. He was active last week, but I think he was probably a little bit limited. That being said, Stevenson is still likely to play a pretty decent sized pass catching role. He's very likely to be, get the vast majority of the carries, get goal line work, all of that. So I like Ramondre Stevenson as a player. I like his role in this offense. I think this price tag is very fair at 6,200. Outside of that, I'm not getting much. If you wanted to think in terms of what's it look like if everybody is just wrong, this is one of those games where you could kind of twist your way into the Seahawks passing game looking good. If the assumption here, because we know Seattle wants to be a run heavy offense, the assumption here is that Charbonnet is going to get a bunch of carries. They're going to continue running. And I think that's a very reasonable assumption. But there is some small chance that their actual adjustment is going to be, we're missing our number one running back. We're going to put the ball in Geno Smith's hands more, utilize DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, Jackson Smith, and Jigba, and play that way. And nobody's projecting this game to go that way. I'm not projecting it to go that way. But I do think that kind of like that Ravens game too, where you have a similar sort of thing where everybody's assuming it's the Derrick Henry game, but what if it's not? You do get, very good pass catchers here and a solid quarterback at a reasonable price tag at no ownership. But again, that's not the way that I'm projecting it to play out. I don't think that it does, but it was a spot that I think is kind of just worth highlighting to give you something to think about if maybe you're a little bit less confident in the way this game's being projected. Rams taking on the Cardinals. This is a game that is going to get a ton of ownership. Some of it, I think, really good. Some of it fine. Some of it scares me. But the Rams missing Puka just opens up a ton of targets, a ton of opportunities. Cooper Kupp is very, very clearly one of the best plays on the slate. 7,600, got 21 targets last week. This is somebody that, if Puka were healthy and Kupp's healthy, there was a decent chance that Kupp was going to end up getting more targets than him anyway. With Puka being out, you very obviously just have a target vacuum for Kupp. But also, this is somebody that's extremely good at getting open and also isn't somebody that's running a lot of routes that are volatile, that are, way downfield or anything like that. You're just likely to have a high completion percentage on passes to Kupp. So it does give him a relatively high floor for a receiver too, in addition just to, the actual number of targets. So he obviously looks great at 7,600. Colby Parkinson projected to be one of the most popular tight ends this week, or probably the most popular tight end this week. $3,100 price tag, 16% ownership. He ran routes on 86% of Matthew Stafford's dropbacks last week, and that is obviously good. Then you factor in that there are more targets available. Tight end's really weak. All of that. It's very easy to see why Parkinson looks good. One potential negative concern that I have about Parkinson, and as you can see, it's not making a huge difference for me. I'm still getting to him, even though I did adjust his projection a little bit for what I'm about to say. The Rams not only lost Puka last week, they did lose 2 starting offensive linemen as well. One way that we see teams adjust when they are missing their 40% of their starting line is tight ends staying in the block more, running less routes, running backs potentially pass blocking more. So there is the potential for that 86% route participation for Parkinson to drop from last week because they decide that they need him more to block. Also, last year, the Rams basically never ran 2 tight end sets. They didn't do it last week. So I don't expect this to be a situation where they just bring in Davis Allen alongside Parkinson. Allen blocks, Parkinson runs routes. If they decide to keep a tight end in the block, it is going to be bad for Parkinson. But he's so cheap and the position's so bad that I still think he looks fine. Kind of the same thing for Kyren Williams, 21% ownership. I'm a little below the field, but he obviously looks good here. He's still dominating touches out of this backfield. Blake Corum didn't even get a carry last week, which is a positive for Kyren Williams. The most likely outcome for the Rams backfield this year with, when Williams is healthy, is that he was still going to be the clear number 1 running back. But from a talent standpoint, there was some chance that Blake Corum took on a bigger role and cut into Kyren Williams a little bit. Last week, Ronnie Rivers was the backup. And if Ronnie Rivers is ahead of Corum in the rotation, there's not really concerns about Williams' workload at all because Rivers is just very clearly a backup running back that is just going to be out there when Williams needs a breather. Whereas the more involved Corum gets, the more there is some chance that he starts cutting into Kyren Williams touches. But last week, very, very good running back rotation for Williams. He dominated touches out of the backfield. He's involved enough as a pass catcher that he has some value there. Although, as I was saying, maybe he does stay in the pass block a little bit more behind a weakened offensive line. But either way, at 6,800, definitely looks like one of the better running back plays. Tyler Johnson at 3,300, getting 13% ownership. I'm a little below the field there. I have less confidence in him than Allen Lazard, which is weird because I don't have a ton of confidence in Lazard either. I never have confidence in these $3,300 wide receiver guys. But, Tyler Johnson is stepping up into a bigger role, probably. We saw him step up with Puka out last week. Jordan Whittington didn't play any role at all, and Tyler Johnson ran those routes. So that's probably what they're going to do again this week. The one caveat is you did have a full week of practice now without Puka. The Rams could have made some changes. It could have been, last week with a mid-game injury, they throw the veteran out there because they know he can handle his role. And then this week, you're going to see more of a split between him and other guys like Whittington. But most likely, Johnson going to play a big enough role to project pretty well at 3,300. Same goes for Demarcus Robinson here at 4K. Wide receiver 2 for the Rams now. Deep threat. So you do get volatility here where Stafford needs to have time to throw the ball downfield for Robinson probably to have a big game. His floor is pretty much non-existent, but it doesn't take many deep completions for a 4K receiver to pay off. So He does make some sense here. He is getting a lot of ownership for a deep ball threat, which is a little bit concerning, but that salary is pretty favorable. On the Arizona side, I'm having trouble getting to them because of their salaries. But I do think that in large field tournaments, they make some sense as runbacks with the Rams. This is a week that I don't think runbacks are likely to be that important for me. They're not showing up a ton in when I was looking at simmed lineups earlier. And it makes sense when you think about the construction of this slate. There's a lot of really good chalk plays that aren't necessarily really correlated with a lot of other things. And so what you're doing by prioritizing runbacks is essentially when you prioritize runbacks, you're giving up some number of projected points, of median projected points, but you're expecting to make up for that because of the correlation that your runback has with the rest of your lineup. On a slate like this, where you have an underpriced Breece Hall, you have Jordan Mason, you have Debo, you have Cooper Kupp, you have these just standalone really, really good plays. The gap between median projection, uncorrelated median projection, and basically you end up giving up too much in the way of median projection that is unlikely to be made up for by the correlation that your wide receiver has with the opposing quarterback and wide receiver. So that's why I don't think runbacks are as important on this slate. Also, just with the way the NFL has been playing last year and especially week one, less passing volume, lower scoring, fewer plays because of more runs, all of that. It just becomes more difficult or less likely that you have that, random wide receiver 2 have a blow up game just because wide receiver 1 on the other side does. But this game is a little bit different. Again, not prioritizing the run backs, like I said, because you can see the exposures over here. But this is a game that has a very high total and a close spread. You could actually just see both teams throwing for the majority of this game. And you do have talent on the Arizona side too. So it does make some sense to pair those guys with the very, very popular Rams. But still, not something that was showing up a lot for me. One thing I did think was interesting also in looking into Arizona, obviously one of the big talking points last week was that Marvin Harrison was essentially non-existent and wasn't getting open and looked really, really slow and bad and all of that. Obviously, you would prefer that not be the case, but the most likely outcome is still that Marvin Harrison's a very, very, very good wide receiver. The most likely case is still that we remember his week one the same way we remember that Jamar Chase couldn't catch the NFL football or whatever it was prior to his rookie season starting. So you do still have upside there, but also, and I'm trying to find the notes so I remember for sure, but Arizona played Buffalo last week, and Buffalo played much differently in their secondary than the Rams did. And again, teams, will adjust to the teams that they're facing. So there's no guarantee this carries over. But last week, the Bills used a lot more too high looks than the Rams did, which again is going to tend to leave the middle of the field open and take away, deep balls down the sideline. Which, if you think about the way that the Cardinals attacked their passing game last week, Greg Dortch and Trey McBride got the bulk of the targets. They were the first read the vast majority of the time on passing plays, and those are the guys that you would expect to benefit if you're going to give up the middle of the field and take away the outside. If you're going to take away the middle of the field and leave open the outside, that opens things up for Marvin Harrison. It opens things up for Michael Wilson, and it does hurt Trey McBride and Greg Dortch a bit. That's not to say you can't play McBride. Obviously, from a talent standpoint, he's about as good as it gets at tight end. But I do like Sam Laporta better in that price range for that reason. But it is more a point of I'm not getting much Harrison, even with this factored in. But again, if you're just like looking at a lineup and you need a completely unowned wide receiver, I think either one of Harrison or Wilson are in good matchups here. Whether they capitalize or not, who knows? But that was something that kind of stuck out to me where it's not super actionable for DFS, but it was at least interesting enough that it stuck in my head, and I'll feel really stupid when I don't have them and they have big games. Cincinnati taking on Kansas City in another game that I'm getting a lot of, and probably everybody's going to have a lot of. Should be a high-scoring game here. Still no T. Higgins for Cincinnati. The Bengals looked horrible last week. Hopefully, Joe Burrow figures out how to play football again. That is, the assumption that I'm making going into this week. But Rashee Rice is dominating exposure for me. I believe he's my second highest owned guy right now, behind Deebo Samuel. He did everything that I thought and was hoping he would do in week one from a usage standpoint. He got 32% of Patrick Mahomes' targets. He was a short average depth of target guy, which you expect based on what we saw in the past. But giving somebody like him the ball, just getting it in his hands and letting him make plays still gives you upside. It's not like he's, some slow, unathletic receiver that is just catching a 5-yard pass and then hitting the ground. He can do a lot with the ball in his hands. So you get that reception upside just from a lot of short targets. You get yards after the catch. He's very, very good at it. So I like him a lot at 6,700. Think he looks really good. Fields at 20%. I am getting a lot more than that. Going back to Yoshivas here, $3,800 price tag in a game where I'm going to be playing a lot of both sides as far as the passing game goes. He disappointed last week, but he was on the field for like 100% of snaps. He ran routes on pretty much every drop back. You can't ask for a lot more than that from a 4K guy. He is popular. I think it's warranted. Patrick Mahomes, 11% ownership, 24% for me. He just, I'm getting to this passing game anyway. I like Rice a lot. I like Xavier Worthy. I like Travis Kelce. I'm actually not getting to Worthy, which I don't like. But either way, I like the Chiefs passing game. I like the Bengals. Getting to a lot of Mahomes here makes a lot of sense, especially because there haven't been a ton of quarterbacks that I love their prices either. Obviously you could pay down for guys like Darnold or Jones and their low owned values. Daniels looks fine, but getting to a lot of Patrick Mahomes seems good. I like Rice, Kelce at 6,200 on a really weak tight end slate, showing up right around the field at 11% for me. I mentioned that I like Xavier Worthy. I bumped him in my projections a bit. I thought he'd show up more, but this is a Cincinnati defense that, again, different opponent last week going up against the Patriots. You don't really have deep threats on the Patriots, so they could adjust the coverages that they play. But last week they did play a lot of 1 high, basically no 2 high or very little 2 high, second lowest frequency other than Cleveland. And if you're going to let Xavier Worthy run deep routes with limited safety help and Patrick Mahomes as his quarterback, I think Xavier Worthy might have a big game. The problem with Worthy is that he is relatively expensive. You are paying for his ceiling at 6,100. He's not somebody that's likely to earn a ton of targets on a game-by-game basis. He's not likely to be that efficient. You are banking on home run plays, like we saw last week. He ended up having a big game. It wasn't through volume. It was because he took in a jet sweep for a score, and then he housed like a 40-yard pass down the sideline. There's not a big difference between what, his performance last week, what the fantasy points he got last week, and him scoring like 7 fantasy points based on the volume he got. So he is going to be really volatile. You are paying for the upside. That's probably why he's still not showing up for me, but I do think the matchup is interesting. On the other side, Mike Gesicki, 3,100, only getting 7% ownership. This one is surprising to me because, you do just have so much ownership coming into Parkinson at 3,100, same price tag. You have a bunch of ownership coming into Akins. Gesicki didn't have a good game last week, but nobody on the Bengals did. They did move him around to different spots on the field. He ran routes out wide. He ran routes from the slot. He ran routes inline. That's what we thought there was a good chance would happen with T. Higgins out, was that Gesicki would be utilized as an actual receiver a bit. And we saw that. He also briefly had a touchdown on DraftKings, which I think would just have people thinking completely differently about him this week. So again, not a confident play, but I also think he should be higher than 7% owned. Jamar Chase, same kind of thing. 7,800. It's really hard to take a big Jamar Chase stand because doing that would mean you're giving up CeeDee Lamb and Cooper Kupp and Justin Jefferson and Garrett Wilson and potentially Breece Hall at the same price range, different position. And I don't really want to do any of that. But at the same time, sub 10% owned Jamar Chase at 7,800 in a game that could be a shootout, where the Bengals are going to need to score points to keep up with the Chiefs at the very least. And no T. Higgins, I think the ceiling for Chase is really, really high. And I think one thing that is kind of keeping the ownership down is probably a little bit of a false narrative. Going into last week, he had said that he thought he was going to be limited. We didn't even know if he was going to play. Then you had the whole questionable with food poisoning thing. And then he goes out there and has, an underwhelming game. There's probably just kind of some natural bias or reasoning that says, I thought that Jamar Chase was going to be limited. He had a bad game, so he was limited, when in fact he really wasn't. He ran routes like 86% of the time. That number, probably goes up this week. So technically maybe he was a little limited, but it's not like he had a small role, being on the field or anything like that. He had a 21% target share. That number almost definitely goes up, especially with Higgins out, but regardless. So I do think that this is just one of those spots where it's kind of like Jonathan Taylor, right? It's not the best point per dollar play. It's not the best price tag. There are, I think, quote unquote, better plays in this price range without a doubt. But it's just one of those plays where if nobody else really wants to play the guy that is very live for 100 plus yards and 2 touchdowns, in a game where I'm playing a lot of other pieces of it anyway, I like getting to Jamar Chase at low ownership. Joe Burrow, no real rushing upside, so not a priority quarterback at 6,300, but not getting any ownership. If you're playing Josephus and Sicky and Chase, may as well be getting some Burrow. Zach Moss, 5% owned. I'm right around the field there. He is somebody that I found his workload week 1 interesting. It was kind of an unknown coming in. There was a lot of talk in the preseason that Chase Brown was kind of 1B to Zach Moss 1A. We clearly saw Zach Moss with the lead in the backfield. If this turns into a game where the Bengals are playing 2-3 touchdowns down, maybe Chase Brown just ends up being on the field a lot as a pass catcher. But Moss does play a big enough role as a pass catcher that he has some fantasy value there. He is a better pass blocker than Chase Brown. He dominated rushing opportunities. So I do think Moss is the number 1 running back here ahead of Brown. I don't think this is like a true timeshare. And he is cheap in what should be a high-scoring game at low ownership. Again, tough to prioritize him when there are so many other good running back plays. But it is somebody where in a specific lineup or in a game stack, I think he does make sense if you need to save some ownership. And then wrapping things up with a game that is much, much, much less appealing. Pittsburgh taking on Denver in Denver. Not a ton for me in this one. The Broncos defense against Justin Fields looks fine. The Steelers defense against Bo Nix looks fine. They are relatively expensive, but they're both going to look pretty good. The only couple of things that I found somewhat interesting breaking down this game, and I am getting to it a little bit, just very little bit. Justin Fields and George Pickens. Pickens did have a 30% target share last week. Now, when your targets are coming from Justin Fields, obviously those don't really count as like full targets because Fields is the one throwing them. But that still speaks to the workload, the opportunity, kind of like we were talking about with Josh Jacobs, where he's pretty likely, the most likely outcome is that he gets a bunch of opportunities and he's not efficient. That's the most likely outcome for George Pickens too. But find me another $5,800 receiver that is remotely likely to be getting 30% of his team's targets, especially talking about guys that are doing it down the field and have upside, not just catching screens and getting tackled after 2 yards. So there is that upside for Pickens. Fields also at 5,400 just gives you rushing upside in addition to, maybe being able to complete some passes to Pickens. Also, and this is again a spot where teams are likely to adjust based on who they're playing, but Denver did play a lot of man coverage last week. Last year, they were pretty split. So I do expect, and it's the same defensive coordinator, so I do expect the zone percentage to increase. But Justin Fields is much better against man. George Pickens is very good against man, which, again, it's the reason that I think you probably see less man this week from Denver than you did last week. But it was something that stood out where maybe they don't adjust enough and you get a little bit of added upside. It's not a reason to be jamming these guys in, obviously, but it is enough for me to just kind of say, I kind of was intrigued by the ceilings they have anyway, and this is another little nudge in that direction. So you can see I'm not taking any sort of big stand on Fields or Pickens, but that was kind of worth interesting to talk about. And then Jaleel McLaughlin at 4,500. I'm not getting there. I'm right around the field at 3%. He is, I think, the cheapest viable running back today. Jordan Mason. I don't know where I was going with that. Is clearly the best cheap play at 5,200, but there's nobody like sub 5K really that I think you can get to other than here. And McLaughlin did play a pretty big role. Like he's likely to be the pass catching back ahead of Javonte Williams. So if this were a game, for example, where Fields does connect a couple times with Pickens, score a couple touchdowns, and Denver is playing from behind, you are likely to see plenty of pass catching options here for a very cheap running back. He did get carries last week too. So I do think there is some upside for him here, but it is a solid Pittsburgh defense. It's a terrible Denver offense. There's 100 good running backs on the slate. So it's kind of just another one in that bucket of this is kind of interesting and I could see it working out. But I also, even if you're playing 150 lineups, it's still only 150 lineups and you're not prioritizing anything there. So that's every game. I'll go back through now and take a look at the positions I'm getting to. As a reminder, for whatever reason, I screwed up my Lions projections. So they're not going to be showing up at these positions, but I assume I'm going to be playing them. So just keep that in mind. But Pat Mahomes showing up the most for me, followed by Mayfield, Daniels, Jones, Darnold, Dak, Burrow, Fields. Happy with all of that. Getting the 5% Stafford, which is an approach that I kind of like to take on slates like this, where you have a lot of ownership coming into Rams pass catchers and not a lot to the quarterback. If all those chalk pieces go off, at least you can correlate them with a contrarian piece at quarterback. But pretty happy with the way my quarterback exposures look at the top. I assume I would probably have some Jared Goff too if I didn't screw up the Lions. At running back, a lot of Josh Jacobs. I talked about that one a lot. Maybe he ends up being a little bit higher owned, but if he's really just going to be sub 10% owned even, I think he's a very good tournament play, even though I don't have a ton of confidence in his efficiency, in his ability to run against what's probably going to be stacked boxes with Malik Willis at quarterback. But I do like the opportunities a lot at basically no ownership. Breece Hall, one of the top plays on the slate to me. Jerome Ford, I think, is going under-owned at 9%, given his workload, the opportunities he gets in this offense. I think his ceiling is as high as anybody in that 5 to 6K range, and he's just not getting the ownership that a lot of other guys are. Jordan Mason, my fourth highest owned running back. He is the field's highest owned. I think he's a good play. I think he's a good value. It's basically just a range of outcomes thing for me where he can have a good game for his salary and still not end up being a winning tournament play. So at that ownership, I'm just playing a little bit more of some other guys. Kyron Williams, Zach Charbonnet, Ramondre Stevenson, perfectly fine with all of these guys based on the opportunities that they're going to get. I think they're all pretty much correctly priced. Williams maybe a little bit underpriced, but it's pretty much just an opportunity thing. Jonathan Taylor, 2x the field on him. It's an upside play. He's not a great median projection, but it's not difficult to picture a game where he scores a couple times, runs for 100 yards. And I also don't, at least right now, don't have Anthony Richardson. And we know that a lot of the touchdown equity on the Colts is split between Richardson and Taylor. So may as well be getting some Taylor in my lineups. J.K. Dobbins, I'm about half the field. I think he's perfectly fine. I like the matchup, but I do think he's just going a little bit over-owned because of an incredibly efficient week one. At wide receiver, this is the one, I probably would have had some Gibbs and Montgomery at running back too. Wide receiver, this is the one that really stood out where I'm pretty sure Amon-Ra St. Brown is one of my top wide receivers, but I completely screwed up the projection when I uploaded it. Debo, Lamb, Kupp, getting a lot of them. Debo, obviously showing up more than like anybody. I think he's just going to be a problem for me this week. I like him for like a million different reasons. I like the way he matches up with Minnesota's coverage. I like the fact that he's likely to get 5 to 8 carries with no McCaffrey. I like the fact that he's likely to get more design plays with no McCaffrey. He's live to vulture a touchdown from Jordan Mason. So I like all of that. And then also in lineups that don't have Jordan Mason, he offers you some negative correlation, some leverage in that the most likely way for Jordan Mason to just not score a touchdown is that he gets vultured by Debo. So I like him for a bunch of different reasons. CeeDee Lamb, self-explanatory. Kupp, self-explanatory. Godwin running more routes out of the slot is good for him, especially in full PPR. 6K is a good price tag. Getting to that game a lot. It's good. Lazard value, Josephus value. Garrett Wilson's a stud. Mike Evans gives you a ton of touchdown upside. Good matchup for Malik Neighbors. Justin Jefferson is a stud. I don't know where my Rice exposure went. I did. But I was getting a lot of him. I don't know what happened there. Yeah. So anyway, I like Rice a lot. I don't know why this is only showing 9%. At tight end, Laporta is not going to show up because I screwed up Lions projections. But as far as payout tight ends go, I do like Laporta. Parkinson, going to be the most popular tight end probably. I like him. I am a little bit concerned because they could keep him in to pass block a little bit more since they're missing 2 offensive linemen. But at 3,100, you can only worry about that so much, I think, but it is a potential negative for a popular play. I like Gesicki at low ownership. Akins should get a lot of opportunities. Zach Ertz primarily is being used with Jaden Daniels just because nobody on Washington pass catcher wise correlates that heavily with Jaden Daniels because of how often he runs. May as well just throw in the guy at the position with the least opportunity cost and hope that he falls into the end zone. Travis Kelce is Travis Kelce. Kate Otten correlates with Baker Mayfield. Shoemaker, not getting much ownership, should step into a bigger role without Jake Ferguson. I do expect a rotation at tight end there, so I don't think it's any sort of slam dunk. But if the field's not going to play him at all, basically, then I think he looks fine. And then at defense, that's what it was, I think. Yeah. Okay, so where I clicked on wide receiver, it's showing you the percentage of the time that a player is in a wide receiver spot, not in all of my lineups. So Rice is showing up in flex most of the time because Casey's a late game. So that answers that. And then finally, defenses pretty spread out, but Packers at 2,600, Panthers at 2,300. That's disgusting, but they're 2,300. I like the Patriots at 2,800. Cardinals at 2,300 is gross, but they do negatively correlate, obviously, with a very popular Rams team, and most importantly, they are cheap. So you can see still just prioritizing cheap defenses that are not popular. That is going to be what I do pretty much every week at that position. So that's all for this one. Good luck on your lineups today. If you have any last second questions, throw them in chat and I will answer them. I'll hang out for a minute, but otherwise, going to get out of here, go back to building lineups, hopefully get the Lions thing squared away. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Endgame Syndicate using the link in the description below. That is a very good way to improve your DFS performance no matter how you approach the game. If you are not a programmer, not great at math, I can probably improve your process, make you at least a little bit better. If you are really good at programming and math, Nerdy Tenor is somebody that you would probably like to talk to. Utica is obviously just like the best to ever do it and does it in a way that I think is different than anybody else I've talked to. If you're somebody that really knows football, knows baseball, knows basketball, Yuta is somebody that basically just knows ball and knows how to factor that into his process. He can help you out with that. Brian, kind of a combination of me and Nerdy, where he's better at programming than me, better at math than me, not as good at it as Nerdy, but kind of a middle ground there if you're not a complete coding genius. So all of us approach the game differently. All of us have had, at varying levels of success. And so should help you out. Check that out if you haven't already. But otherwise, thanks for checking out the show. Subscribe to the channel, hit the thumbs up button, and good luck on your lineups this week. I'll be back tomorrow morning with Neil on this channel talking about the Monday Night Football game. Good luck again on your lineups.